Many of you will have heard Adrian on the radio or seen him on TV over the last 3.5 years or so, both state and nationally, as an expert presenter on COVID-19. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Esterman today to bring us up to date on the COVID situation.
Thank you very much, Frida. Frida and I have been friends for many years and really treasure her friendship. Look, I'm going to attempt to start off. Here we are. Let's start off with the global situation. So, our government's sort of telling us that it's all over, life gets back to normal. But how is Australia compared to the rest of the world in terms of the current situation? And what we see is both Australia and New Zealand aren't doing very well. This is a fairly recent map, and basically it shows that we still have some of the highest rates in the world, and certainly in the Southern Hemisphere. Coming to the Australian situation, these are the daily cases per 100,000 population. Now, these are very difficult to interpret, and the reason is that many people aren't bothering to get tested, and some states, like Victoria, aren't including the rapid antigen test results, so they have an artificially low number. But basically, what you can see is that South Australia isn't doing particularly well, and of course New Zealand is in the worst situation than any of the states in Australia. This probably won't make a lot of sense to you, but at the moment these are all sort of subvariants, or nearly all subvariants of Omicron. And the one that's leading at the moment is something called EG.5. But what this is really telling you is there's this big mishmash or soup of subvariants that are in Australia at the moment. And we have at least a single case so far of the new one called BA.2.86, which is very different to other Omicron variants and potentially can cause another wave. As I said, it's very difficult to interpret case numbers. So what we're seeing here is that there was a big peak mid-year in Australia, and that's really died off now. But these numbers are quite artificial, and I'll show you how in a minute. This is hospitalizations, which is a much better picture of what's happening. And yes, indeed, hospitalizations have been dropping and have sort of stabilized now, but you can't really see it there, but they are starting to go up slightly now. And they're a much better picture of what's happening. Now, one way of trying to work out what's happening in terms of cases is by looking at the percentage of cases diagnosed that end up in hospital. Now, at the beginning of the year, there were only about 5% of cases ending up in hospital. Now there's 20%. This isn't because it's got more severe. This is simply because there are so many people who are no longer being diagnosed but still get COVID that they end up in hospital. And this shows you that there's really about 4 times as many cases as are diagnosed. So in reality, we still have quite a nasty epidemic in Australia. And this is weekly deaths, which thankfully have dropped quite low now. You're looking at about 50 deaths a week in Australia. And you might think, well, that's not too bad, but it's still several times more than the number of people who die from motor vehicle accidents. And those get on the news every day. We see nothing about COVID deaths. This is really concerning. At the moment, there's 123 outbreaks in aged care homes in Australia. 123 homes have got outbreaks. Why? What are we doing about it? The answer is not a lot. This is a very simple slide, and it simply shows that nearly everyone in Australia has been vaccinated to some extent. 96% have had 2 doses, and 70% have had a 3rd dose. But this is the really worrying slide for me. And what this is telling us is that only 47% of people who are 75 years and older are up to date with their booster shots. So you're looking at 53% who aren't, and that means they're at high risk. And even for the over 65, it's only 35% are up to date with their booster shots. Now, looking around the room, most of you are in one of those 2 categories. How many of you are up to date with your booster shots? Because you're risking it. You're risking it. Believe me. Okay. For the vast majority of Australians, it's not that important. Okay. If they get COVID, they get COVID. Not going to die from it. But for people who are elderly, yes, they can die from it. In fact, nearly all deaths are in elderly people. So one of my messages, which I'll show at the end, is please make sure you're up to date with your booster shot. What about South Australia? How does that compare to Australia? Very similar patterns. So here's weekly cases. You see this enormous drop-off of cases recently, which is artificial, as you'll see. This is hospitalisations. Now, SA Health gets very worried when there's more than 250 people taking up hospital beds, and we haven't seen that since June, and that's really good news. So at the moment, the pressure on our hospital system is reasonably mild, nothing that SA Health will worry about, except for the fact that we're still getting a lot of staff off sick, and that does put pressure on the hospital system. Now, do you remember that other one I showed you for the national figure? This is the same thing for SA Health. So at the beginning of the year, there were 2% of diagnosed cases hospitalised. It's now 8%, so 4 times as many. And again, it shows you how much underdiagnosis there is in South Australia. And this is weekly deaths, so we haven't had any deaths for a little while, which is obviously very pleasing. SA Health is a bit weird in that they announced no deaths, then suddenly a huge number of deaths, because they don't actually divvy out the time frame when the deaths happen. They could be 3 or 4 weeks or even a couple of months out of date. So we get these sort of boluses of deaths coming every now and then. And this is South Australian aged care homes. We were talking about Helping Hand. We have 19 active outbreaks in aged care homes in South Australia as we speak. 19. So, to me, the issue is, what are we doing about it? And, unfortunately, as we'll see in a minute, you've only got half of aged care residents who are up to date with their vaccines. What are the GPs doing? What are the management of the aged care homes doing? Why aren't the residents up to date with their booster shots? A little bit about vaccinations. Now, ATAGI is the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, and they've changed their recommendations just very recently. And what they're saying is, if you're 75 years or older, you should get a booster shot if you haven't had one in the last 6 months. But if you're 65 and over, 65 to 74, you should consider getting a booster shot. But I think that's nonsense, and where they get them from, I've got no idea. I believe that if you're 65 and over, you must get a booster shot. But this is just a target. And by the way, there is a new vaccine becoming available, probably in December. It's what we call a monovalent vaccine, because it's only got one strain in it, and that's called XBB.1.5. Now, the really good news is that this new vaccine gives very good protection against all of those super subvariants I showed you. Okay, it's very close to them, and it gives great protection against them, and even against BA.2.86, this very nasty one that's going around the world at the moment. It's good protection against all of them, much better protection than the existing vaccine, which is based on BA.4.5. So, unless you're travelling overseas or there's some very urgent reason to get it, I'd hold off until December and get the new vaccine. It'll give you much better protection. If you do get infected, especially if you're over 65, you really have to get antivirals. There's 2 which are available in Australia at the moment. There's Paxlovid, and there's one called Molnupiravir. This is a study. It was what we call Lancet preprint. In other words, the Lancet, which is the most prestigious medical journal, have got a space for papers that haven't yet been peer-reviewed. And so this was published in there. And this is a Victorian study, so it's local, and it's what we call a data linkage study. So what they've done is they've taken the records from hospitals, the records from the vaccination registry, the records from deaths, and linked them all together, and done what we call a case control study. The average age of the 45,000 people in this, who were nearly all vaccinated, was 77 years. What I'm trying to say is that this is a typical group of people who will be getting antivirals. And what did they find? So what they found was that Paxlovid did the best of all. It reduced hospital admissions by a huge amount. So those who didn't have antivirals, you've got 12% ended up in hospital. But if you did get Paxlovid, it was only 3.5%. And Molnupiravir was much better than having no antiviral, but not quite as good as Paxlovid. The problem with Paxlovid is it interacts very badly with many other medicines, and also you can't really have it if you've got what we call kidney impairment or liver impairment. So molnupiravir is really the second line antiviral. They'll give you Paxlovid if they can. If they can't, they'll go to molnupiravir. Importantly, this Victorian study showed that if you're going to have antivirals, you take them as quickly as possible. If you don't have them after 5 days, then they don't work at all. And the quicker you take them, the better they work. So I think that's very important. And that means getting access to your GP to get a script for them. And they won't give you a script unless you've got a positive test. So you need a positive test, either a PCR or an endorsed rapid antigen test done at the GP surgery. And then you get your script for antivirals and you can take it as quickly as you can. Now, this is really a crazy system. In New Zealand, for example, they give at-risk patients a prescription for the antiviral. Okay, you don't need to have a test or anything, they just keep the prescription. Then if they do get sick, they can immediately give it into the pharmacy. Pity we can't do that here. Long COVID. So long COVID is, according to WHO, it's when you have symptoms 3 months after your initial infection and they last for at least 2 months. Again, a recent Victorian study, which has been published in this preprint server. And what it showed was, and it's based on 23,000 people. These are huge studies. And this is Victorian local data. They showed that 18% of people who got infected with COVID ended up with long-term health problems. 18%. You don't want to get COVID. Although the majority of people are fine, you're going to get this sort of rump of people who end up with long-term health issues. And unfortunately, the more times you get infected, the greater your risk of long COVID. So even if you get it once, try not to get it again, okay? Because you stand a much higher chance of getting long COVID. And as you can see, the risk factors they found in their study was being female, being 50 to 69 years, which I imagine is quite a few of you here, having pre-existing health issues, rural and remote areas, and importantly, being vaccinated protects you against long COVID. Another reason to get a booster shot. The other thing that protects you against long COVID is having an antiviral. Another reason for getting an antiviral. So these are the sorts of symptoms you get. There's a huge range of them. And the thing people don't understand is that the COVID-19 is not a respiratory condition. Although it first latches onto your lungs or your upper respiratory area, it can infect every part of your body and does, including your brain. So look, take-home messages, all right? The first is that despite what the government is telling us, COVID is still with us, and it keeps changing. It changes its spots all the time. And at the moment, we've been extremely lucky in the sense that all of these new subvariants aren't any more severe. But what makes a new subvariant take off is it becomes more transmissible, not it becomes more severe. So any new subvariant, it's a toss of the coin whether it's better or worse in terms of severity. So to date, we've been very, very lucky in the sense that all of these subvariants haven't been more severe, but they could be. And then we're back to lockdowns, etc. Now, hopefully that's a remote possibility. Hopefully it will settle down so we get these waves of Omicron subvariants into the future, each one being smaller than the previous one. In the end, it ends up as a sort of influenza-type seasonal disease, which it isn't yet. The second thing is protect yourselves. Be up to date with your vaccine, especially if you're at risk. If you're going out into a fairly risky area like a supermarket and you're in that at-risk group, protect yourself, wear a face mask, don't care what other people think, okay? Finally, if you do get sick and you're in that at-risk group, take your antivirals, take them quickly. And then you're doing everything to protect yourselves. For the younger people here, why would you bother to be up to date with your vaccine? Well, a few things. Firstly, as I pointed out, if you're up to date with your vaccine, you have less chance of having long COVID. And that's a good reason for doing it in the first place. But secondly, many of the younger people here would have elderly parents. By vaccinating yourself, you're protecting them rather than protecting yourself. So the real take-home message here is please look after yourselves. This COVID-19 is still with us. For most people it's not a major issue, but for a lot of people it is. And nearly all deaths so far in Australia have been in elderly people. So I'll stop there. Very happy to take questions. Oops. Sorry, I just got people tripping over here. Yes, please, fire away. You might need to shout, I'm a bit deaf. Yeah, okay.
Thanks very much for that. Really precise but informative. And so, all of those things that you talked about with COVID, they could be applied to the flu as well. So, where's the COVID risk as a country versus the flu risk?
Good question. So the actual mortality rate, so what percentage of people who get the infection die, is not too dissimilar to influenza. It is higher, but not a huge amount higher. But the main problem is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is way, way more transmissible. So far more people, many, many times more people get infected with COVID than with flu. And therefore you get far more deaths from COVID than from flu. So yeah, in terms of the actual rate of deaths, it's similar. But it's actually a huge impact because of the number of people who got infected.
Is there a long flu?
Yes, there is. So almost all viruses can end up with a post-viral syndrome, but nowhere near as bad as we've got with COVID-19. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. 5 shots and I haven't turned into a 5G transmitter, and I'm very disappointed that I'm still having to pay my monthly mobile bill. My question is around 2 aspects. One, why has the government literally dropped this off the radar completely? It is hard to find detail around it, and there's certainly no information and certainly no media and promotion. And the second question, which is unrelated, is in regard to mutation. How often are we seeing this mutation now? In the early stages there was quite frequent mutation. Has our vaccination reduced that? Or has our lack of vaccination created an environment where it's continuing to mutate at a level where it's starting to become unsafe again? Thank you.
Yeah, why the government's dropped the ball? That's a very difficult question. You'll have to ask the government. I mean, one potential reason is that they care more about business than people. A second potential reason is they care more about young people than old people. But apart from that, I really couldn't tell you. I think it's disgraceful. There's been almost no messaging encouraging people at risk to get booster shots, for example. I mean, not only our federal government, where's our state government? So I can't really answer that. I'm not part of the government. I used to be, but not anymore. In terms of what's happening with mutations, it is thought, and we don't have actually proof, but it is thought that most of the mutations that are happening now occur in people who've got impaired immune systems, so their body can't get rid of the virus quickly, and the virus stays in their body for a long time and has a chance to mutate. So it's really got nothing to do with the vaccines. This is a natural thing that occurs when you have people with impaired immune systems.
Thank you very much. I thought your address was excellent.
Thank you.
Very timely. You only need to go to a restaurant down in Adelaide to see evidence of photos from skin and I was presenting at one of the applications we wrote recently. There's a table of 12 and I said to the host, it's only because my wife and I going out to diners, and said, we're having a group of doctors in and a couple of them had COVID, and so the whole thing got
Sure. Look, there's a couple of points there. The first is that current vaccines, in fact all vaccines to date, do not prevent infection. It's a myth to think that they do. They never did. In fact, the very original one against the Wuhan original strain did for a while protect against infection. That was the only one. So our current vaccines will not stop you from getting infected. They might for 2 or 3 weeks when you first get vaccinated, but after that, no. What they do is keep you out of hospital. Okay? And that's true for just about every vaccine, including influenza. So influenza vaccine is only 60% effective against infection. So don't think because you're vaccinated you won't get infected. You can be. But as I said, what it does do is it boosts your immune system and keeps you from getting severely ill. And we have really no idea why some people get very, very sick and others don't. This is one of the things that is being researched. There's thought to be a genetic component. But really and truly, this is one of those areas which is still very much under research. So some people can get infected, they get severely ill, and others with a very similar background get infected and they get nothing. It could well be that, and again there's some research, that the more virus particles you get infected with, the more sicker you get. So if you're unlucky and breathe in, a million virus particles, you get much more sicker than someone who only breathes in 100,000. But again, this area is under research. So does that address your questions? Yeah, everyone's immune system is different. A lot of it's genetic. A lot of it is previous exposure to other viruses and things like that. So there is no one-size-fits-all in terms of your immune system.
Thank you. I just want to first let you know that I have a GP. There's one other in the room.
Oh dear.
If you want to know what we're doing, I can certainly tell you. But it's also telling a lot of people don't take our advice. But my question to you is that since we've had COVID and previous pandemics we've had, what do you have a prediction of what the next pandemic will be? Well, that's I'd like to know which one you think is the one we're going to face next.
Yeah, let me start off by saying that one thing that to me is very clear is that the government has given up on protecting its population. It should be the first job of any government to protect its population. Our state and federal governments aren't doing it anymore. And the trouble is that for the majority of the population, getting infected isn't a major problem. But for people who are over 65 and those with impaired immune systems, it is. So who is looking after them? A lot of them will not be health literate. A lot of them won't know what to do if they get infected. A lot of them will struggle to get access to a GP. So for me, the key group who can help people who are over 65 and people with impaired immune systems are GPs. And many GPs are doing the right thing. They're developing care plans with their at-risk patients, etc., but a lot of them aren't doing it. And so I go around the country talking to GPs, and I'm trying to encourage them to be proactive, write to their at-risk patients, explain to them what to do. For example, they have all these symptoms of COVID out of hours. Who do they contact? How do they get tested? How do they get a script for antivirals? So I applaud what the GPs are doing, but not all of them are doing the right thing. So sorry, I forgot what the initial question was. Okay, so the answer is we don't know. If I want to take a guess and get out my crystal ball, I would say it was avian flu. At the moment, we have an avian flu going around, which thankfully only rarely goes into humans, but it has a mortality rate when it does of like 70%. It's very, very nasty. It could mutate and take off, in which case we've really got a problem. So that's my guess.
Very simple question, Adrian. How reliable do you believe rat tests are?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. Okay, so what we have in sort of diagnostic tests is something called diagnostic accuracy. Okay? And that comes in two flavors. One's called sensitivity, the other specificity. So sensitivity says, if you're actually infected, what's the chance of the test coming out positive? And specificity says, if you're actually negative, what's the chance the test will come out negative? Well, it turns out the rapid antigen tests have almost got 100% specificity. In other words, if you don't have COVID, the test is almost invariably going to say you don't have COVID. The big problem comes in sensitivity. That is, if you are infected, what's the chance that it's going to come out positive? And the way the government have done it is they've got regulations that all rapid antigen tests must have at least 80% sensitivity. That means that if you're actually infected, there's an 80% chance it'll come out positive. But there's a big issue, and that is, how do they actually measure this? Well, what they do is they benchmark the rapid antigen tests against PCR tests. So they say, if the PCR test says it's positive, what happens when you do the rapid antigen test? And the big problem with all of this is that PCR tests themselves aren't particularly accurate. And they've only got 80% sensitivity. So that means the true sensitivity of a rapid antigen test is only about 60%. It's almost a 50-50 toss-up. So the answer is no, they're not very accurate. And the best way of using them is to do them serially. So if you've got symptoms, you do a test. If it comes out negative, you do one 24 hours later. If it comes out negative 24 hours later, then it becomes much more accurate. But a single individual rapid antigen test, unless you're chock-a-block full of COVID-19, it won't come out positive.
Thank you, Professor. I really enjoyed you sharing your knowledge with us, and thank you very much. Also enjoyed watching the TV from time to time, hearing your advice. I'm going to ask a bit of a controversial question because I had COVID in May last year, and about this time I had kidney biopsy and the diagnosis which related to COVID virus, and I'm still sort of being watched in terms of the kidney problem, and the nephrologist advised me not to have another vaccination. So I just wondered, that's a controversial question, I wonder if you could give us your advice on what you think about that.
Look, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not willing or able to give advice to individuals. All I can do is really talk about generalisability. But I mean, why would your clinician say you don't get another vaccination? There are very few people who basically can't get the vaccine. Very few. There's only very few conditions which would say don't get it. So you'd have to speak to one of our GPs here who could, I'm sure, seriously advise you on that. I'd be getting a second opinion. In fact, I always get a second opinion because I don't trust anyone, basically. And I'm sure our GPs get second opinions as well. So I really can't address that. I say that there aren't many conditions which would affect you where you can't get vaccinated.
Professor, can I ask you? Professor, thank you very much. Fabulous talk. We've all learned.
So I don't think the mic's working.
Has it been proved definitively that the COVID virus did start in Wuhan? What are the...
Okay, so there's no such thing as definitive proof. It doesn't exist in the world, okay? It's the balance of probability we talk about. So the question is it probable that it started in Wuhan? The answer is yes. As to whether it actually was a leak from the Wuhan laboratory or whether it came from the wet market, that's very controversial. My own feelings are it's most likely to have been come from the Wuhan virus laboratory, but it wouldn't have been a deliberate leak because it wiped out the Chinese economy. It would have been an accidental leak, and that's not unheard of. When I used to work in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and in the next office to me, they were developing smallpox through eggs, chicken eggs. And while I was there, apparently some escaped out of the air conditioning into the street and someone walking past caught smallpox. So these leaks do happen, okay? So it's not at all surprising, but as I said, we don't have evidence which way around it is, and it's highly controversial. Political ramifications, yes and no. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we've been expecting a major pandemic now for several years, and when I used to teach epidemiology, I used to say to the students, we're way overdue for a major pandemic. I thought it was going to be influenza, a very nasty influenza, but it turned out to be the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So.
Adrian, what Dan Andrews is quite news at the moment, but from your point of view, statistically, we have a variety of different approaches taken
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually on ABC Radio this morning talking about exactly that. Start off with the federal government, whose responsibility is quarantine, is looking after major pandemics. It's in the Constitution, okay? Said, no, we don't want to do this, we're going to give it to the states to look after. So they washed their hands of the whole thing. So I think it's a bit cheeky for them to say, now we're not going to look at the states, what the states did. So for a start, I think that the inquiry which is being developed is a half-hearted thing designed to reduce any embarrassment to the government. And I just think it's a great shame. Because we can learn an awful... The thing is, all of these inquiries end up being political bum fights. And we don't need that. What we need is to learn some really good lessons from how it was handled and what to do in future. I'm just afraid that's not going to happen. As to how long you should have a lockdown for, let me just say that at the beginning of the pandemic, we knew nothing. We knew there was this nasty virus around. We saw that there were heaps of deaths in Greece and Italy and in the UK. We had no vaccine available. We didn't even know if we could get a vaccine for it. And having lockdowns was a typical public health response. It's what we've been doing it for hundreds of years. And it works. It did work. Our numbers of cases was very low compared to other countries. As to how long lockdowns should be for, that's a very difficult question, and hopefully it's one that will be discussed in the inquiry. I haven't got any feelings for whether they had it on for too long or whatever. I think each state and territory just had to make their own decisions, and it was a very difficult time for them. And no one wants to lock up their population for weeks, if not months on end. It's not good for anybody. New South Wales, who did the opposite, and basically it was just let it go and so on. You could argue that they're the ones who actually infected the whole of Australia. We had very few cases around Australia until New South Wales decided to leave its borders open and infect everyone. So, and that's not to be discussed because the states' things aren't coming through in the inquiry. It shows you how stupid it is. So I think lockdowns were essential, but as to how long or how widespread, that's a very difficult one and something we're going to have to look at. I do think that what was badly missing, though, was messaging from our state and territory governments and federal government. If you're going to say to people, do not go more than 10 kilometres from your house, you've got to explain why. Why not 5 kilometres? Why not 1 kilometre? Where's the evidence? None of that was explained. And so they're expecting people to follow all these rules without any explanation as to why they were there. I think that was a really big mistake. Sorry, I hope that answers your question. Absolutely. So look, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and I respect everyone's opinions. But my feelings are that at that stage, at the beginning of the pandemic, we simply didn't know what to do. Every state and territory was floundering. We know now that Sweden didn't do too badly out of it. You're absolutely right. But they're a different population, and in fact, they have a very obedient, compliant population. And they did say to people to stop mixing, to reduce how many people, their socialisation, etc., etc. So they did have rules in place, but they weren't forced rules or mandated rules. They were expecting the population to comply, and they did. So a different country, it's very difficult to say, should we have taken the Swedish approach? I don't know. I'm hoping that's one of the things we'll look at. One of the things we should be looking at is how other countries approached it and what happened to them, and etc. So to give an example, I was providing some advice to the Singapore government, for example. And what they're doing is they're creating far more green areas throughout Singapore so that people spend more time outdoors. I mean, what a sensible idea. All new hotels in Singapore now have to be dual purpose, so they have proper air conditioning systems so they can be used as quarantine stations. So wonderful approaches. The question is, are we going to follow that, or are we simply going to ignore what's happened overseas and go our own way? So you're quite right. We should be looking at places like Sweden to see what they've done, but it is difficult to actually say they're the same population as us, because they're not.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there.
All good.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. The monies collected today go to Rotary Youth and Projects, so thank you for being our guest speaker. Also, we have a little gift for you. You may or may not know it's our centenary year this year, so there are a couple of books that have been written by members about our centenary. Thank you so much, and thank you, Terran, for the question.